Hey, kids. You know how in so many episodes I say, well, normally we go 50 minutes to an hour, but this time I don't have as much material as usual, and I don't think we're going to get there. And then somehow it turns out that I did because there's just that much to say about Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Casey Stengel, Hans Wagner, Bobby Meacham. Can I tell you, Baseball Reference is my favorite site in the world. I use it multiple times every day, whether in my work at Baseball Prospectus or here for the show and for other projects as well. And it's a wonderful thing, and I'm happy to support it. I subscribe to the StatHead feature. It's how I get a lot of the statistics that I use on the show. If I say, who was the best first baseman in White Sox history? No one knows. Well, you can start that project there. The answer, of course, is, well, it depends. It depends if you count Frank Thomas as a first baseman. If you don't, if you prefer to think of him as a DH, then, well, we can have a discussion. A long one, as it turns out, because I've had a bunch of good ones, but not necessarily a bunch of great ones. Jose Abreu, Paul Konerko, you say Banura, I say Banana. Let's call the whole thing off. Back in ye olden days, if I had a thought like, who's the best first baseman in White Sox history, I'd have to page through a bunch of books to put the list together and then look up all the statistics individually. But nowadays, it's just a few clicks away, so they have made my life both easier and better in terms of doing my job. But I'll tell you this one thing that bothers me. They think that Bobby Meacham was called Bob. I grew up in what we call the tri-state area. I'm aware that other parts of the country also have tri-state areas that they just make up out of random parts. Oregon, Mississippi, Michigan. Have you ever been in a hotel room in another state and you managed to turn on the TV? I almost never turn on the TV somehow when I'm away because that's not my purpose to watch TV. That's what we do at home. Outside, we're on the move. But you turn on the TV, or maybe you're walking through the airport, or you're in a bar and you catch a station that says, tonight on the WBOX News, here's what's happening in the Pentastate Polycule this day. And you think, what is this made-up nonsense? No wonder these people voted the way they did. But even worse is when they actually do call themselves the tri-state area, because at none of those times am I in New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut, which is, based on what I'm used to, the one legitimate usage of that expression. In any case, because I lived in the only tri-state area, I'm sorry if I've just wiped your part of the country off the map. I'm sure you can come up with another name for it, but I saw every game that Bobby Meacham played, every E6, I swear, most of them anyway. And he was never Bob. If he had been Bob, he wouldn't have made so many errors. There is a cause and effect or reciprocal relationship there between his being Bobby and Bob. Bob is just a guy that you know from work, but you don't socialize with Bob. You socialize with Bobby. But you see, you're also familiar with Bobby because he's relatable, but you respect Bob. Bobby would throw the ball 6 feet over Don Mattingly's head, but Bob would not because Bob has a pocket protector in this reality. I know this from experience because my late father was born, as you know, I've discussed it many times, in a foreign country. He did not have an American-sounding first name, and once he got out of school, his future in-laws, my mother's parents, my grandparents, said, you're never going to make it in business with the name that you have. What if you're just Bob? So in business, he was Robert or Bob. I never heard anyone ever call him Robert, but I heard plenty of people call him Bob. And unlike his original name, Bob got his resume replied to, and Bob got to be an executive and make big salaries. But he wasn't Bobby ever because he wasn't that kind of approachable most of the time, as my daddy could be sure in his way, but not at work, where he was in command as Bob. Now that I think about it, anytime I got in trouble with him, and it was fairly often, it was probably Bob who administered all my discipline. Having said that, I begin to wonder if my grandparents hadn't invented the character of Bob, would I have had a different sort of relationship with my father? If Bobby Meacham had not come up as Bobby, but had come up as not even Bob, but Cal. Cal does not make any errors. The official scorers have decided. For those of you who are not living in the official, the authentic tri-state area at the time, 1985, his one full season, Bobby Meacham, a Cal-like 156 games, hit 218, 302, 266, 16 doubles, 2 triples, 1 home run, stole 25 bases in 32 attempts, made 24 errors at shortstop, seemingly all of them crucial. Also led the American League in sacrifice bunts with 23. 8th overall pick of the 1981 draft, I believe it was, by the St. Louis Cardinals. Didn't work out, but then it wasn't going to work out either way. He was behind Ozzie Smith in one place and with a team that hated young players in the other. And I'm not making fun of him because certainly at the time I felt bad for him, how much hostility, how much pressure he was under. And we've discussed this before, but he made the mistake of throwing a ball away on opening day against the Texas Rangers in front of George Steinbrenner, and the next thing he knew, this was 1984, he was back in the minors, not at AAA, but at AA. There are times when you wish a guy could just quit, and that would have been one of them. I don't mean quit baseball, I mean in the old take this job and shove it sense. Sometimes dignity demands that you do that, even if at the same time it's sort of self-harming and is going to put you behind the 8 ball financially. Sometimes in life, you just have to stand up for yourself. I don't think there's ever a time where it's right to be abused, to say, no, I just have to accept this. Not in your personal life, not certainly in your professional life. One way or another, there's always another job. The additional unfortunate thing for Bobby Meacham is that he was part of a litany of shortstops that came after Bucky Dent, or who came after Bucky Dent would be the more grammatically correct way of saying it, and prior to Derek Jeter, which of course, as of the early 80s, no one knew that Derek Jeter was the one who was promised. He was only 8 years old or 7 years old at the time. But following Bucky Dent, there was Roy Smalley, who could hit but had a bad back, couldn't really field. Meacham, who wasn't a great fielder, never really put it together offensively. Wayne Tollison, scrappy gamer-type guy, couldn't hit much at all. Alvaro Espinoza, 3 seasons, same deal. Andy Stankiewicz, also same deal. Spike Owen, Mike Gallego, actually pretty good, but was in his early 30s, started getting hurt. And then Tony Fernandez, far from his best, and he did the franchise the service of having a season-ending injury just as Jeter was ready to go, so he got out of the way. Oh, and I skipped Rafael Santana, 1988 shortstop. Last full season in the majors, practically his last season in the majors altogether. He was kind of a double threat, not a good fielder, not a good hitter at all. They were pretty mad at him, actually, in 1988 by the time that they realized this about him. I'm not sure why they thought the Mets would be so eager to get rid of him, or why Davey Johnson would keep benching him for such awesome defensive players as Kevin Mitchell. I'm glad that Santana came up, actually. Can you tell I'm speaking without notes this week? Because I am. It's true. That's one of the reasons why I'm pretty sure I don't have as much material as usual. There is no secret history of the St. Louis Browns up my sleeve. Del Pratt, what a good player, underrated player. 46.3 WAR. They don't call him Delly, they called him Del. Or would it have been Derry? His real name was Darryl. Bobo Newsom, Junior Stevens, why did Reggie Cleveland never pitch for Cleveland? This and other mysteries of the Penta State area up next. No, the reason that I'm glad that he came up is that, as you recall, he was the starting shortstop of the 1986 Mets, except when Sid Fernandez and anyone else who had a fly ball tendency was on the mound, at which point Davey Johnson would sub him out for someone who could actually hit. This year is the 40th anniversary of that championship. It is also the 40th anniversary of the last time the Mets won a championship. And I'm sure the team has something planned for later in the summer to celebrate the occasion. It seems such a shame that Gary Carter is no longer with us, unfortunately. He was so important to that team. He knew it, too. Or I should say that he knew he could be. He had 5 and 10 rights when he was traded from the Expos, and he had asked to be traded. He was not happy with the situation there at the time, and he could have vetoed the trade to the Mets. But what he said was, I'm aware of the fine nucleus the Mets have. They just missed winning the pennant last season, and I feel I can do my part to help them win a championship. And he was right. They hadn't just missed the pennant. They had missed winning the division title, the NL East title, to the Chicago Cubs. And then maybe had they gone to the playoffs, they might have beaten the Padres in the playoffs, as the Cubs failed to do. But in any case, it hadn't happened. He helped them get close again in 1985. And then in 1986, you know what happened. And I was just thinking about how it was the anniversary of that team. And it wasn't my team necessarily. I was neither a born Mets fan nor someone who jumped on the bandwagon, but I certainly enjoyed the ride that happened all around me, being in the tri-state area, not the pentastate polycule. And although Davey Johnson and Carter are gone, that team has had pretty good luck with its longevity in the years since then. So although there may be one or two guys whose characters are questionable, you may not want them to show up for a reunion if they do have an event like that. And if I've already missed it somehow, then forgive me. But you can have a very good turnout for an event like that in terms of guys that the fans would love to see. I just checked, actually. They're doing it in August, so buy your tickets now. I guess my anniversary thinking started a couple of episodes back when I was telling you about how next year, this is very simple math on my part. I don't pretend that I was doing a public service or anything. This was just something that occurred to me that we could talk about, but that next year would be the 100th anniversary of the 1927 Yankees. And unlike the Mets, obviously, 100 years on, no one's going to be there from that roster. As I said to you at the time, Mark Koenig was the last, and he's been gone over 30 years now. However, they should still do something. Well, I'm glad that the Mets are going to do something, but I was trying to think of what this occasion would mean to me, having, unlike 1927, lived through it. And one of my favorite baseball memories from when I was a teenager was losing my, well, no, that's a different podcast. I mean, a baseball memory that I was part of, not watching somebody else do something or hit a ball over a building. I was a teenager, and it was the fall of 1986, and the fire alarm went off in my high school. And this wasn't a planned fire drill where the bells rang and everyone stood up, marched outside for about 90 seconds, and then turned around and came back, having proved that they could respond appropriately if there were an actual emergency. But indeed, it was an actual emergency. It wasn't a big one, as it turned out. If I recall correctly, one of our school chemistry labs had a minor burn going. And so the process was the same as if someone had pulled it for illicit reasons, just for the fun of it, as dangerous as that might be. And that happens sometimes too, as I'm sure it did when you went to school, wherever you went to school. And so we went out and we stayed out until the firemen could arrive and see that someone had already hit the fire with an extinguisher, then quickly check over the rest of the building to certify that nothing had somehow jumped out of that one room, and drive away again, which was, of course, disappointing because I was always rooting for a chance to go home early, especially on a baseball day, which this one was. It was the first or second week of October. There were only 2 rounds of playoffs back then, as I'm sure you well recall, the LCS Series and the World Series. And at that time, Major League Baseball still permitted the odd day game in the postseason. I guess we have some of them now early in the postseason tournament where they get rid of some of the division series games, the non-Yankees and Dodgers ones, during the day. But back then, it was still the case that some of the marquee matchups, in this case, Houston Astros versus New York Mets, would be played in the afternoon. And that day's game was due to start as we were standing outside milling around pointlessly for about half an hour, about 10 feet back from the building, where all the kids who smoked, even though it was against the rules, pretended to be invisible, and the faculty pretended that they were invisible as well when they went back there to smoke with them. Were we out of the blast radius, assuming the building was about to pop? Hell no, but we were expendable. I can only assume so anyway. Well, normally I would seek out my friends or my girlfriend at the time during what was essentially a free period, but I had other things on my mind. Fortunately, I well knew that some of my teachers did as well. In fact, my English teacher from that very period was a known Mets fan. And as I was standing out there, she walked by holding a very small radio to her ear. No cell phones back then, no streaming. She had the actual broadcast of the game going, not that I could hear it. And I wasn't the only one who shouted out, "Hey, Mrs. Nichtolp! What's the score, Mrs. Nichtolp?" And I don't remember specifically what she said, but I do know it was along the lines of, "Scoreless, top of the 4th, but Ray Knight is on." And then she walked on down the line, I assume repeating that information as she went. Scoreless, but Knight's on second. And then eventually we went back inside, which again was disappointing. I stopped doing homework and she gave me a D or F that quarter. But still, in that moment, we were together. We were as one, as was everyone else together who shouted out that same question. We were a community at that time. There was legitimately a lot of excitement about that club, which certainly had a lot of charisma. Don't get me wrong, I knew a lot of Yankees fans, and a lot of them were annoyed at the smugness of Mets fans, but the Mets fans had also been suffering since, depending on how you want to figure it, 1969 or 1973, and man, were the years after 73 a slog. So they deserved their chance to enjoy the run that team was on. And if you could put aside your partisanship and just watch them perform as a baseball fan, watch Keith Hernandez field a bunt, watch Lenny Dykstra play, and yeah, I know this is a loaded thing, but watch Lenny Dykstra play like he was holding a fork and that fork was stuck into an electrical socket. Watch Darryl Strawberry whip the bat the unique way he did through the strike zone and crank a ball to the moon. Watch Dwight Gooden freeze a guy with a curveball, or Bobby Ojeda with his changeup. It was a privilege to watch one of the great teams of all time. Perfect team? No. Perfect people? Obviously not, but I don't think that's true of any team. And I mention them here not out of any nostalgia for that club specifically, because, again, my affinity with them was not emotional. It was, as I described, aesthetic. And I have had many aesthetic experiences since then, although none identical to that. Rather, what I miss is the moment with the radio. A time when we could all be together, a togetherness, a feeling of community that seems to be lacking now that our lives are so atomized. A togetherness that increasingly can only be found in the infinite inning. Hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 376 in an ongoing series. Who am I? I am your congenial host, Stephen Goldman, for another trip to the past on a mission to better understand the present, the time machine being baseball, but a smaller time machine than usual, because I really did speak true when I said that I have a lot less going on this week than I normally do. I've been swamped on a number of levels, and I'm not trying to tell you about my problems. Don't tell us about your problems. Just tell us the stories. Isn't that your job? That's not meant to be my impression of you. That's meant to be my accurate depiction of the voice in my head that tells me that everything I'm doing is wrong. Suffice it to say that in some weeks, what I want to talk to you about is jumping up and down and punching me in the nose and saying, pick me, and it's not hard to put the show together. In other weeks, that idea plays a little harder to get, but ultimately, while I'm in the process of looking at my possibilities, it does the same thing. It finally reveals itself. It says, why didn't you realize I was here all along, you big jerk? And then it punches me in the nose. And then there are weeks like this one where it wasn't jumping up and down and trying to punch me in the nose. It remained hidden, and time that I would have normally dedicated to figuring out where it was had to go to other projects. And so I'm just here flying by the seat of my pants, which is fun in its way too. You've heard me talking many times on this show about the years when I was a columnist for the defunct New York Sun newspaper, and they would call me a couple of hours before my deadline. That was when my topic for the day got approved. And quite often, they would say, yep, no problem, and we'd sail from there, and I would just have to write 1,000 words in a very compressed amount of time, and that was fun. However, there were other days where they might say, your topic is approved, but then half an hour later, after I'd started writing, they'd come back and say, hey, the columnist who's superior to you is taking your topic, so think of something else. now. And that was fun but sweaty. Or they would say stretch. Or they would say, we sold an ad over half your column, so you only get 700 words, so be concise. Which meant I got paid the same amount of money for doing less work. At the same time, I had to cram more information into a smaller space, so it was still worth their publishing it, and it was not damaging to my own reputation, because if you're a writer, your byline is everything, and if you put stuff out under your name that's not quality, people are going to stop reading you. The point is, I learned to love working under pressure, but that's not always manageable with this show on the schedule that I produce it and the way that I like to do it, which is to let the actual characters speak. But to find their words, you have to know who they are and what story you're telling. And sometimes, to do that correctly, I need a 7-day week to be 10 days long. Sometimes I can achieve that by dark magic that's entirely my own, but some weeks, like this one, I don't quite get all the way there. And so, on that note, let's take a break. And on the other side, I'll catch you up on the stuff that I've been doing outside of this show and for this show, as I always do. And before we chalk this one up to experience, and I free you to enjoy the holiday weekend without having to give me so much time, I'm going to bring back, just for a brief cameo, possibly the most popular historical character I've ever discussed here on the program on the Infinite Inning. A certain very large but very happy catcher of 100 years ago. Sometimes instead of a chest protector, I imagine him wearing a lobster bib, and it's not impossible that it happened that way. So if you'll pardon me complaining for one moment more, another thing that's been vexing me is the instability of the program with which I record this show. It used to be just fine, but lately it's been acting rather quirky, and I think I'm going to have to move on, which is an expensive proposition and also comes with a learning curve, which I'm not looking forward to, just because it's going to eat more of my time, which would normally go to working on the program. I work from notes. The notes have the outline of the story that I want to tell. And if, as I said a few minutes ago, there are actual quotes from the subjects of the stories, then my notes have that, because I can't always reproduce those 100% from memory, especially as I'm getting older and more distracted. Most everything in between is extemporaneous. And so what's stressful is when I say something and I think, oh boy, that was really good. That was really clever. You really showed them that time, boy. You sure did. And then the program crashes and says, yeah, the last half hour that you recorded, that again, you made up on the spot and it just sort of happened naturally and sounded natural. That's not going to be recoverable, sorry. And that can be true no matter how often I hit the save button. And the most hilarious thing is this joke it likes to play on me, where I say something, it crashes, and then it says, would you like to use the auto recovery file? And I say, yeah, that seems like a great idea, because you died before I could actually save that last pithy comment that I made. So I click the yes button, and when it loads, I do not hear the last thing that I said. I hear shrilling banshees from hell until my ears bleed. For the last few weeks on and off, I've been reading reviews of possible replacement programs, and they all suck. Every review has so many cons that seem like deal breakers for me. And the other part, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, in the software that you use in your walks of life, you don't purchase software anymore, you rent it. I know that's increasingly common, but podcasting is not exactly a high-margin business for those of us at the level at which I am doing it, and so I have to take seriously every time I add an expense to this program's monthly burden. And thus I feel stuck and have resolved nothing, and the only reason I bring this up is I'm kind of white-knuckling the show, because again, every time I think, oh boy, that was a great comment, a great knee slapper, oh, we're getting towards the end of the show, that's good, that's good, that's good, and it dies. I might be set back to the beginning, which increases the chance that you won't get an episode that week, and I don't want that to happen, because we've made a deal, you and I. Was it Harlan Ellison who had the book title Sleepless Nights in the Procrustean Bed? I think we're kind of there. Is that a good analogy? I'll let you look that one up. Briefly, Over at Baseball Prospectus this week, I wrote something called The One After 1999, which was just as improvisational as one of those old Sun columns, in that I started out with not very strong of an idea about current low offensive levels. I talked about the dead ball era Dodgers first baseman, although they weren't the Dodgers then, Tim Jordan, the death of the monoculture, the way that baseball still has the potential to have a monoculture because it's a monopoly controlled by basically just a small group of people, but they choose not to QC the product so that they know what they're going to get each year, which is cool in one sense because it arises organically, but on the other hand, sometimes what you get organically is not that great, and this year feels that way, at least to me, right now. And I also talked about Elvis, the Beatles, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and the rest of the gang. Did it all hold together? I wasn't sure, but my editor, who I respect, said it did. And the first reader, the only reader who left a comment, said, "Great stuff." So I have to defer to the wisdom of crowds. Finally, over at Patreon, we had the usual four-man flotilla of players. I wish I could talk about the ladies every once in a while, but baseball is segregated by gender. What are you going to do? I wish it wasn't like that. I feel like the first woman who is good enough to play professional baseball will be the Jackie Robinson of her time, and the powers that be are never going to let that happen. Scouting types who I've spoken to insist that it can't happen, which I think is unproven. I mean, most of the male population can't play baseball either. At the professional level, I mean. Sandlot, maybe, around the neighborhood, sure, but not at the professional level. So it's not exactly this damning thing to say, most women physically can't do it. I have no trouble believing most is true. Do I believe that all is true? Hell no. I've also seen way too many little guys be wrist hitters and be strong that way as opposed to being huge, muscular Aaron Judge hulks. If a woman took up baseball from a young enough age, learned to be very patient, learned to do small ball things, was able to run and field, given a large enough sample population, I'd think you had a chance of uncovering a major league ball player. But again, I'm never going to get to find out whether that's the case or not. But if baseball wants to be the story again, the way football and basketball are, if it wants to be a game for everyone, if it wants to be universal and international, that is one way to go about getting there. One other caveat, just as I'm happy that Jackie Robinson came along and made America a more equitable place, I am sorry that Jackie Robinson had to go through what he went through for us to get there. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Similarly, I think as a society, we're such a mess that we're not set up well to embrace or support a female baseball pioneer. I don't follow any version of basketball very closely, but I get the impression that the WNBA has shown that quite a bit as well. There was a story, and I realize I'm not picking the right guy here, but about 40 years ago, Garrison Kaler, who later, of course, had his career as a radio guy short-circuited by accusations of sexual harassment, but he wrote a short story, and it's a humorous short story. I don't know how good it is, really. It's called What Did We Do Wrong? And it was about the first woman to play Major League Baseball. And I'm pretty sure that his characterization of that woman was pretty patronizing. But putting it aside, the gist of the story was essentially that people were so unable to handle it, so unable to just adjust themselves to the idea of a female baseball player that ultimately she quits. And whereas, again, the story, nothing brilliant, the author, problematic, but I find the conclusion kind of believable. Obviously, there have been some women in baseball, some important ones, Helen Britton, Effa Manley, and I felt free to talk about them here and others as well, but that's not really what that series is designed for. And I should finally get around to telling you who we covered this week in case you're interested. The first was outfielder Merrill Hogue, I believe the only Merrill in Major League history, but not the only Hogue in professional baseball history, as the story explains. Baseball Reference argues that he just wasn't worth it. And I question and try to get into whether that is accurate or not. Catcher Thurman Munson, that's 2 Yankees in a row, by the way. Hogue was primarily a Yankee. Thurman Munson, I could have written a book about, as others have written books about him. I chose instead to focus on the Hall of Fame controversy that at least used to go on around him. He was on the ballot for 15 years and never really came close, which is kind of dumb. Penalizing the guy for dying. Had he lived, he almost certainly would have gone in, given his accomplishments to that point. even if he was falling off physically in that stage of his career. I would say it's cruel instead of dumb, except that due to his unfortunate accident, he's beyond cruelty at all, or kindness. However, his widow is still around, as are his 3 kids, and his love for them, his desire to be around them, directly contributed to his being on that plane in the first place, or not being on it, but flying it. Why not let them, even all these decades later, have that last salving gesture? What does it cost you? According to the Jaws stat, by the way, he is the best catcher eligible, but not in. Now, you want to draw the line under Ted Simmons, but above Thurman, Munson, whatever. I mean, Buster Posey's going to go in, right? He will one of these days. Statistically, there's very little difference between them. One had 45 WAR, one had 46. Both played about 1,400 games. Buster hit 302, Thurman hit 292, but in a tougher era for hitting. Both had 1,500 hits. Both were 7-time All-Stars, both won a Rookie of the Year award and an MVP award. I mean, I'm not arguing for either, and I'm not arguing against either. I'm just saying that unless you believe that there was an ineffable, magical something that Buster Posey had that Thurman Munson didn't, and you think Buster should go in, then logically there's no argument against the other guy except that he made the mistake of flying that plane. I also looked at the marvelous George Mazel, a one-year Cubs wonder who wasn't that wonderful, and the great 1950s slugger Joe Adcock, and I asked the musical question, how is it that he only had 300 home runs instead of the 500 that if you just squint your eyes and imagine some Rod Serling alternative universe that he might have wandered into or out of, it's pretty clear that in that world he might have gotten there or was more likely to get there than your typical player. And that brings us almost up to 3/4 of the way through the current run of 100. I believe Mr. Adcock was number 75 or 76. I have made Mr. Adcock free to all, as I usually make one post a week free. So please, as always, drop by and see if you enjoy the merchandise. And now, with your kind permission, I will take one more short break before the end of the episode, and on the other side, just a quick anecdote about your favorite player and mine, the great catcher Frank Shanty Hogan, and impulse control, a problem for most of us, at least sometimes. You know, a moment ago when I said that Joe Adcock, in another universe where adverse conditions, or at least some of them, had been prevented, he would have gotten to 500 home runs, or at least stood a good chance of doing that? I mean that he was more likely to get there than, say, Bobby Meacham, unless, of course, they had called him Bob. But then Bob would have been hitting 30 home runs a year, not making 30 errors. I'm not always looking for a new anecdote about Frank Hogan, Shanty, but you know damn well I'm going to share one if I come across it. For those who came in after our extensive Shanty coverage in past episodes, Shanty himself was extensive. He was an athletic kid from Somerville, Massachusetts, who had such an unrelenting food addiction that he ate his way out of that athleticism and right out of his career while still in his 20s. At his best, he was a 300 hitter with a little pop, although his stats are a bit inflated because he played in the offensively hot 1920s and 1930s. He wasn't built like Alejandro Kirk. He was a bigger guy. He had more stature, but I think both at their best were similar hitters. Decent batting averages in context, double-figure home run power, but no threat to lead the league. Kirk is more patient. Shanty liked to swing away. He made great contact, though, was among the National League's tougher hitters to strike out. He also threw very well, at least until he got so fat that it impaired his mechanics. I realize it's very blunt to say fat, but if you see pictures or films of him at the most bloated phases of his career, it would be kind of dishonest to say that he wasn't severely overweight, not just by baseball standards, but in general. Even when his performances were fine, he was an aesthetic nightmare for his managers who couldn't stand to look at him out there. His clashes with his managers over his diet are the main focus of most stories about him, and those are the stories that I told in our previous episodes about Shanty. And so I'm not going to recapitulate them here. I just want to emphasize that we know that baseball has always permitted athletes of every body type to play: tall, short, skinny, thickly built, rangy, squat. There have been players, and Alejandro Kirk is one actually, but I was also thinking of Matt Stairs, who seemed like they were this close to being cubes, like you could almost store them in a box. And yeah, some have been kind of globular too. It's kind of neat to think of Ted Williams, especially early on, although he thickened later, but the splendid splinter, tall, thin, shared the same league with Yogi Berra, who was kind of a fire hydrant with arms. So there's nothing inherent in baseball that said that Shanty couldn't be overweight and still play. And in fact, his career proves that he could, at least for a while. And the fact that he later stopped playing well is likely related to the fact that his weight got out of hand, but it doesn't necessarily prove it. A lot of other things could have gone wrong as well, including, just like a lot of catchers, he reached the end of the line early. The other thing that seems reasonable that his managers felt, but you can't prove, is that he would have been better had he been skinnier. At the end of his career, his weight really does seem to have affected his defense. Would he have run better? Probably. Would he have hit better? There's no way of saying. Before that, though, it really was an aesthetic issue in that his managers just didn't want to see him that way, in that he conflicted with their image of what a perfected baseball player looked like. And I'm reminded of an occasion, not concerning him, but concerning Casey Stengel, who once, as a player, when Casey, who was a center fielder and a right fielder and not heavy, but there was a game when he made a critical error, and his manager, Wilbert Robinson, Uncle Robbie, ripped him just on sort of an ad hominem basis for being a poor example of a baseball player. Not in terms of conduct, but in terms of shape. And if you look at pictures of Casey, he was squatly built with a low center of gravity. Again, not overweight, just oddly proportioned. And so Robbie, in the midst of this anti-Stengel rant, said, "With legs and an ass like that, you shouldn't be a ball player. You should be I should be what?" Stengel asked. "I was just trying to think," Robbie replied, "but I give up." It's kind of difficult for me to describe what Uncle Robbie was referring to. If you look at photos of Casey as a player, he was officially 5'11", which wasn't short at all for a guy born in 1890, but he was still somehow shorter than his height should have made him. It's almost as if his waist is in the wrong place or he's wearing his belt too low. He's longer above it than he is below it. He doesn't look like an Olympic swimmer, say. And in a moment of frustration, Robbie grabbed onto the ways that Casey conflicted with his image of a ball player. Shanty got that same treatment from his managers, not because he had an unusual physique by birth, but rather due to large steaks and baked potatoes with sour cream and ice cream sundaes with all the trimmings. And as long as he played well, he could get away with it. But as I've already said, his managers were correct that he was so compulsive that eventually the problem would get away from him, and it did. Why was he like that? Why are any of us like that, even selectively? Some of the people can resist the call of overeating all the time, and all of the people can resist overeating some of the time, but not all of the people can resist overeating all of the time. I call it making a saving throw, like in a role-playing game, when you're about to take damage, but you try to duck it. The dungeon master rolls his dice, and if you get a good number, the bad guy's arrow misses you and hits Scott instead. Don't worry, Scott deserves it. Sometimes, though, you don't make that saving throw, which means you do anything from having a cookie that you probably shouldn't, no big deal for most of us, to having two you shouldn't, to eating the whole bag. You know who should eat the whole bag? Scott. Shanty never made his saving throws. He, too, ate the whole bag. I think you can see this quality of his mind in what is not an eating story, but a baseball story. This comes via the New York Daily News, March 9th, 1932. This was during New York Giants spring training in Los Angeles. Shanty Hogan actually stole second base during today's practice game. This was considered miraculous, first because the thief was Hogan, and second because the Hogan left knee is still swelled to the size of a California grapefruit. When Hogan came back to the bench, John McGraw that is, asked him his reason for stealing with the team leading by 3 runs. Nobody out, and pitcher Freddie Fitzsimmons, hard hitter, at bat. "Oh," says Hogan, shrugging his massive shoulders helplessly. The idea just got into my head and I couldn't resist it. That is one of the most dangerous phrases in all of human existence. That idea just got into my head and I couldn't resist it. It explains so many deleterious and self-harming things that we do. You may as well append an additional 8 words to it. The idea just got into my head and I couldn't resist it. And that's how I wound up in the infinite inning. Nov schmaz kapop, you betcha, and I hope you enjoyed this episode in spite of its improvisational nature. Should you wish to enjoy me on social media in a nice way, please follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. There remains a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. And folks have also been writing me through the Patreon group as well of late, and I welcome that too. Speaking of which, should you wish to support the show, and you darn well tootin' better believe I hope you do, please visit patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Again, the Dead Player of the Day series goes on there as well, and as you saw in this episode, at times it becomes part of the show as well. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the -infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, resist the urge to eat a whole bag of cookies in revenge. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "Why don't you do an imaginary story when the advent of AI came in the 1950s?" And Casey is asked about it, and he says, "They tell me they have a machine that can play chess, and that's good, but nobody in chess ever had to hit behind a runner with a man on first, and if they did, the machine would probably bunt, which is what most of my players did when I told them not to, so in that respect, they would fit right in with some of the clubs I manage, which you can look up." Well, I think you just did. So what's left for me to say except I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.